his effort, he could not scramble on top. Every time he tried, the barrel rolled round and ducked him under again. It was really empty and floated light as a cork. Though his ears were full of water, he could hear the elves still singing in the cellar above. Then suddenly the trapdoors fell to with a boom and their voices faded away. He was in the dark tunnel, floating in icy water, all alone. For you cannot count friends that are all packed up in barrels. Very soon a grey patch came up in the darkness ahead. He heard the creak of the water gate being hauled up, and he found that he was in the midst of a bobbing and bumping mass of casks and tubs, all pressing together to pass under the arch and get out into the open stream. He had as much as he could do to prevent himself from being hustled and battered to bits. But at last the jostling crowd began to break up and swing off, one by one, under the stone arch and away. Then he saw that it would have been no good even if he had managed to get astride his barrel, for there was no room to spare, not even for a hobbit, between its top and the suddenly stooping roof where the gate was. Out they went under the overhanging branches of the trees on either bank. Bilbo wondered what the dwarves were feeling and whether a lot of water was getting into their tubs.
You doing okay?
Some of those that bobbed along by him in the gloom seemed pretty low in the water, and he guessed that these had dwarves inside. I do hope I put the lids on tight enough, he thought. But
yes, I was talking to the deer. And I gave it a thumbs up if you're wondering. Because that's what I do.
He managed to keep his head above the water, but he was shivering with the cold, and he wondered if he would die of it before the luck turned, and how much longer he would be able to hang on, and whether he should risk the chance of letting go and trying to swim to the bank. The luck turned all right before long. The eddying current carried several barrels close ashore at one point, and there for a while they stuck against some hidden root. Then Bilbo took the opportunity of scrambling up the side of his barrel while it was held steady against another. Up he crawled like a drowned rat and lay on the top, spread out to keep the balance as best he could. The breeze was cold, but better than the water, and he hoped he would not suddenly roll off again when they started off once more. Before long, the barrels broke free again and turned and twisted off down the stream and out into the main current. Then he found it quite as difficult to stick on as he had feared, but he managed it somehow, though it was miserably uncomfortable. Luckily, he was very light, and the barrel was a good big one, and being rather leaky, had now shipped a small amount of water. All the same, it was like trying to ride, without bridle or stirrups, a round-bellied pony that was always thinking of rolling on the grass. In this way at last, Mr. Baggins came to a place where the trees on either hand grew thinner. He could see the paler sky between them. The dark river opened suddenly wide, and there it was joined to the main water of the Forest River, flowing down in haste from the king's great doors. There was a dim sheet of water no longer overshadowed, and on its sliding surface there were dancing and broken reflections of clouds and of stars. Then the hurrying water of the Forest River swept all the company of casks and tubs away to the north bank, in which it had eaten out a wide bay. This had a shingly shore under hanging banks, and was walled at the eastern end by a little jutting cape of hard rock. On the shallow shore, most of the barrels ran aground, though a few went on to bump against the stony pier. There were people on the lookout on the banks. They quickly poled and pushed all the barrels together into the shadows, and when they had counted them, they roped them together and left them till the morning. Poor dwarves. Bilbo was not so badly off now. He slipped from his barrel and waded ashore, and then sneaked along to some huts that he could see near the water's edge. He no longer thought twice about picking up a supper uninvited if he got the chance. He had been obliged to do it for so long and he knew only too well what it was to be really hungry, not merely politely interested in the dainties of a well-filled larder. Also, he had caught a glimpse of a fire through the trees, and that appealed to him with his dripping and ragged clothes clinging to him cold and clammy. There is no need to tell you much of his adventures that night.
See that, man?
For now we are drawing near the end of the eastward journey and coming to the last and greatest adventure, so we must hurry on. Of course, helped by his magic ring, he got on very well at first, but he was given away in the end by his wet footsteps and the trail of drippings that he left wherever he went or sat. And also he began to snivel, and wherever he tried to hide, he was found out by the terrific explosions of his suppressed sneezes. Very soon there was a fine commotion in the village by the riverside, but Bilbo escaped into the woods, carrying a loaf and a leather bottle of wine and a pie that did not belong to him. The rest of the night he had to pass, wet as he was and far from afar. But the bottle helped him do that, and he actually dozed a little on some dry leaves, even though the year was getting late and the air was chilly. He woke again with a specially loud sneeze. It was already grey morning, and there was a merry racket down by the river. They were making up a raft of barrels, and the raft elves would soon be steering it off down the stream to Lake Town. Bilbo sneezed again. He was no longer dripping, but he felt cold all over. He scrambled down as fast as his stiff legs would take him, and managed just in time to get onto the mass of casks without being noticed in the general bustle. Luckily there was no sun at the time to cast an awkward shadow, and for a mercy he did not sneeze again for a good while. There was a mighty pushing of poles. The elves that were standing in the shallow water heaved and shrugged. The barrels now, all lashed together, creaked and fretted. "This is a heavy load," some grumbled. "They float too deep. Some of these are never empty. If they had come ashore in the daylight, we might have had a look inside," they said. "No time now," cried the raftman. "Shove off." And off they went at last, slowly at first, until they had passed the point of rock, where other elves stood to fend them off with poles, and then quicker and quicker as they caught the main stream and went sailing away down towards the lake. They had escaped the dungeons of the king and were through the wood, but whether alive or dead still remains to be seen. Chapter 10. A warm welcome. The day grew lighter and warmer as they approached the log. After a while the river rounded a steep shoulder of land that came down upon their left. Under its rocky feet, like an inland cliff, the deepest stream had flowed lapping and bubbling. Suddenly the cliff fell away. The shores sank. The trees ended. Then Bilbo saw a sight. The lands opened wide about him, filled with the waters of the river, which broke up and wandered in 100 winding courses, or halted in marshes and pools dotted with isles on every side. But still a strong water flowed on steadily through the midst. And far away, its dark head in a torn cloud, there loomed the mountain. Its nearest neighbours to the northeast and the tumbled land that joined it to them could not be seen. All alone it rose and looked across the marshes to the forest. The lonely mountain. Bilbo had come far and through many adventures to see it, but now he did not like the look of it in the least. As he listened to the talk of the raft and pieced together the scraps of information they let fall, he soon realized that he was very fortunate ever to have seen it at all, even from this distance. Dreary as had been his imprisonment and unpleasant as was his position, to say nothing of the poor dwarves underneath him, still he had been more lucky than he had guessed. The talk was all of the trade that came and went on the waterways and the growth of the traffic on the river as the roads out of the east towards Mirkwood vanished or fell into disuse, and of the bickerings of the lakemen and the wood elves about the upkeep of the Forest River and care of the banks. Those lands had changed much since the days when dwarves dwelt in the mountains, days which most people now remembered only as a very shadowy tradition. They had changed even in recent years, and since the last news that Gandalf had had of them. Great floods of rains had swollen the waters that flowed east, and there had been an earthquake or two, which some were inclined to attribute to the dragon, alluding to him chiefly with a curse and an ominous nod in the direction of the mountain. The marshes and bogs had spread wider and wider on either side. Paths had vanished, and many a rider and wanderer too, if they had tried to find the lost ways across. The elf road through the wood which the dwarves had followed on the advice of Bjorn now came to a doubtful and little-used end at the eastern edge of the forest. Only the river offered any longer a safe way from the skirts of Mirkwood in the north to the mountain-shadowed plains beyond, and the river was guarded by the Wood Elves' king. So you see, Bilbo had come in the end by the only road that was any good. It might have been some comfort to Mr. Baggins, shivering on the barrels, if he had known that news of this had reached Gandalf far away and given him great anxiety, and that he was, in fact, finishing his other business, which does not come into this tale, and getting ready to come in search of Thorin's company. But Bilbo did not know it. All he knew was that the river seemed to go on and on and on forever, and he was hungry and had a nasty cold in the nose, and did not like the way the mountains seemed to frown at him and threaten him as it drew ever nearer. After a while, however, the river took a more southerly course, and the mountain receded again, but at last, late in the day, the shores grew rocky. The river gathered all its wandering waters together into a deep and rapid flood, and they swept along at great speed. The sun had set when, turning with another sweep towards the east, the Forest River rushed into the long lake. There it had a wide mouth with stone cliff-like gates at either side, whose feet were piled with shingles. The Long Lake. Bilbo had never imagined that any water that was not the sea could look so big. It was so wide that the opposite shores looked small and far, but it was so long that its northerly end, which pointed towards the mountain, could not be seen at all. Only from the map did Bilbo know that way up there, where the stars of the Wain were already twinkling, the running river came down into the lake from Dale, and with a forest river filled with deep waters what must once have been a great deep rocky valley. At the southern end, the doubled waters poured out again over high waterfalls and ran away hurriedly to unknown land. In the still evening air, the noise of the falls could be heard like a distant roar. Not far from the mouth of the Forest River was the strange town he heard the elves speak of in the king's cellars. It was not built on the shore, though there were a few huts and buildings there, but right out on the surface of the lake, protected from the swirl of the entering river by a promontory of rock which formed a calm bay. A great bridge made of wood ran out to where, on huge piles made of forest trees, was built a busy wooden town. Not a town of elves, but of men, who still dared to dwell here under the shadow of the distant Dragon Mountain. They still throve on the trade that came up the great river from the south, and was carted past the falls to their town. But in the great days of old, when Dale in the north was rich and prosperous, They had been wealthy and powerful, and there had been fleets of boats on the waters, and some were filled with gold, and some with warriors in armor, and there had been wars and deeds which were now only a legend. The rotting piles of a greater town could still be seen along the shores when the waters sank in a drought. But men remembered little of all that, though some still sang old songs of the dwarf kings of the mountain. Thror and Thrain of the race of Durin, and of the coming of the dragon, and the fall of the lords of Dale. Some sang too that Thror and Thrain would come back one day, and gold would flow in rivers through the mountain gates, and all that land would be filled with new song and new laughter. But this pleasant legend did not much affect their daily business. As soon as the raft of barrels came in sight, boats rowed out from the piles of the town, and voices hailed the raft steerers. Then ropes were cast and oars were pulled, and soon the raft was drawn out of the current of the forest river and towed away round the high shoulder of rock into the little bay of Lake Town. There it was moored not far from the shoreward head of the great bridge. Soon men would come up from the south and take some of the casks away, and others they would fill with goods they had brought to be taken back up the stream to the Wood Elves' home. In the meanwhile the barrels were left afloat, while the elves of the raft and the boatmen went to feast in Lake Town. They would have been surprised if they could have seen what happened down by the shore after they had gone and the shades of night had fallen. First of all, a barrel was cut loose by Bilbo and pushed to the shore and opened. Groans came from inside, and out crept a most unhappy dwarf. Wet straw was in his draggled beard. He was so sore and stiff, so bruised and buffeted, he could hardly stand or stumble through the shallow water to lie groaning on the shore. He had a famished and a savage look, like a dog that has been chained and forgotten in a kennel for a week. It was Thorin, but you could only have told it by his golden chain and by the colour of his now dirty and tattered sky-blue hood with its tarnished silver tassel. It was some time before he would be even polite to the hobbit. "Well, are you alive or are you dead?" asked Bilbo quite crossly. Perhaps he had forgotten that he had had at least one good meal more than the dwarves, and also the use of his arms and legs, not to speak of a greater allowance of air. "Are you still in prison, or are you free? If you want food, and if you want to go on with this silly adventure, it's yours after all and not mine. You had better slap your arms and rub your legs, and try to help me get the others out while there's a chance." Thorin, of course, saw the sense of this, so after a few more groans he got up and helped the hobbit as well as he could. In the darkness, floundering in the cold water, they had a difficult and very nasty job finding which were the right barrels. Knocking outside and calling, only discovered about 6 dwarves that could answer. They were unpacked and helped ashore, where they sat or lay muttering and moaning. They were so soaked and bruised and cramped that they could hardly yet realize their release or be properly thankful for it. Dwalin and Balin were 2 of the most unhappy, and it was no good asking them to help. Bifur and Bofur were less knocked about and drier, but they lay down and would do nothing. Fili and Kili, however, who were young for dwarves, and had also been packed more neatly with plenty of straw into smaller casks, came out more or less smiling, with only a bruise or 2 and a stiffness that soon wore off.
"I hope I never smell the smell of apples again,"
said Fili.
"My tub was full of it. To smell apples everlastingly when you can scarcely move, and are cold and sick with hunger is maddening. I could eat anything in the wide world now for hours on end, but not an apple."
With the willing help of Fili and Kili, Thorin and Bilbo at last discovered the remainder of the company and got them out. Poor fat Bomber was asleep or senseless. Dory, Nori, Ori, Oin and Gloin were waterlogged and seemed only half alive. They all had to be carried one by one and laid helpless on the shore.
Well, here we are,
said Thorin.
And I suppose we ought to thank our stars and Mr. Baggins. I'm sure he has a right to expect it. Though I wish he could have arranged a more comfortable journey. Still, all very much at your service once more, Mr. Baggins. No doubt we shall feel properly grateful when we are fed and recovered. In the meanwhile, what next?
I suggest Lake Town, said Bilbo. What else is there? Nothing else could, of course, be suggested. So leaving the others, Thorin and Fili and Kili and the Hobbit went along the shore to the great bridge. There were guards at the head of it, but they were not keeping very careful watch, for it was so long since there had been any real need. Except for occasional squabbles about river tolls, they were friends with the Wood Elves. Other folk were far away, and some of the younger people in the town openly doubted the existence of any dragon in the mountain, and laughed at the greybeards and gammers who said that they had seen them flying in the sky in their young days. That being so, it is not surprising that the guards were drinking and laughing by a fire in their hut, and did not hear the noise of the unpacking of the dwarves or the footsteps of the four scouts. Their astonishment was enormous when Thorin Oakenshield stepped in through the door.
Who are you and what do you want?
They shouted, leaping to their feet and groping for weapons.
Thorin, son of Thrain, son of Thror, king under the mountain,
said the dwarf in a loud voice, and he looked it, in spite of his torn clothes and draggled hood. The gold gleamed on his neck and waist. His eyes were dark and deep.
I have come back. I wish to see the master of your town.
Then there was tremendous excitement. Some of the more foolish ran out of the hut as if they expected the mountain to go golden in the night, and all the waters of the lake to turn yellow right away. The captain of the guard came forward.
And who are these? He asked, pointing to Fili and Kili and Bilbo. The sons of my father's daughter, answered Thorin. Fili and Kili of the race of Durin, and Mr. Baggins, who has travelled with us out of the rest. If you come in peace, lay down your
giant
arms,
forest.
We have none, said Thorin, and it was true enough.
Their knives had been taken from them by the Wood Elves, and the great sword Orcrist too. Bilbo had his short sword,
the crystal cave.
hidden as usual,
back for that.
but he said nothing about that.
It's some kind of cool granite.
We have no need of weapons. We'll return at last to our own as spoken of old. Nor could we fight against so many. Take us to your master.
He is at feast, said the captain.
Then all the more reason for taking us to him,
burst in Fili, who was getting impatient at these solemnities.
We are worn and famished after our long road, and we have sick comrades. Now make haste and let us have no more words, or your master may have something to say to you.
Follow me then, said the captain, and with 6 men about them, he led them over the bridge, through the gates, and into the marketplace of the town. This was a wide circle of quiet water, surrounded by the tall piles on which were built the greater houses, and by long wooden quays with many steps and ladders going down to the surface of the lake.
It's a big tree.
From one great hall shone many lights,
I think
and there came the sound of many voices.
We shall see.
They passed its doors and stood blinking in the light,
look
looking at long tables filled with folk.
They're really big.
I am Thorin, son of Thrain, son of Thror, king under the mountain. I return,
cried Thorin in a loud voice from the door, before the captain could say anything. All leapt to their feet. The master of the town sprang from his great chair, but none rose in greater surprise than the raftsmen of the elves who were sitting at the lower end of the hall. Pressing forward before the master's table, they cried, "These are prisoners of our king that have escaped, wandering vagabond dwarves that could not give any good account of themselves, sneaking through the woods and molesting our people." "Is this true?" asked the master. As a matter of fact, he thought it far more likely than the return of the king under the mountain, if any such person had ever existed. "It is true that we were wrongfully waylaid by the elven king and imprisoned without cause as we journeyed back to our own land," answered Thorin. "But Loch Nor Bar may hinder the homecoming spoken of old. Nor is this town in the Wood Elves' realm. I speak to the master of the town of the men of the lake, not to the raftmen of the king." Then the master hesitated and looked from one to the other. The elven king was very powerful in those parts, and the master wished for no enmity with him, nor did he think much of old songs, giving his mind to trade and tolls, to cargoes of gold, to which habit he owed his position. Others were of different mind, however, and quickly the matter was settled without him. The news had spread from the doors of the hall like fire through all the town. People were shouting inside the hall and outside it. The quays were thronged with hurrying feet. Some began to sing snatches of old songs concerning the return of the king under the mountain. That it was Thror's grandson, not Thror himself, that had come back did not bother them at all. Others took up the song, and it rolled loud and high over the lake. "The king beneath the mountains, the king of carven stone, the lord of silver fountains, shall come into his own. His crown shall be upholden, his harp shall be restrung, his hall shall echo golden, to songs of yore sung. The woods shall wave on mountains and grass beneath the sun. His wealth shall flow in fountains and the rivers golden run. The stream shall run in gladness, the lake shall shine and burn, and sorrow fail and sadness at the mountain king's return." So they sang, or very like that, only there was a great deal more of it, and there was much shouting as well, as the music of harps and of fiddles mixed up with it. Indeed, such excitement had not been in a town in the memory of the oldest grandfather. The Wood Elves themselves began to wonder greatly, and even to be afraid. They didn't know, of course, how Thorin had escaped, and they began to think their king might have made a serious mistake. As for the master, he saw there was nothing else for it but to obey the general clamour, for the moment at any rate, and to pretend to believe that Thorin was what he said. So he gave up to him his own great chair, and set Fili and Kili beside him in places of honour. Even Bilbo was given a seat at the high table, and no explanation of where he came in, no songs had alluded to him, even in the obscurest way, was asked for in the general bustle. Soon afterwards, the other dwarfs were brought into the town amid scenes of astonishing enthusiasm. They were all doctored and fed and housed and pampered in the most delightful and satisfactory fashion. A large house was given up to Thorin and his company. Boats and rowers were put at their service, and crowds sat outside and sang songs all day, or cheered if any dwarf showed so much as his nose. Some of the songs were old ones, but some of them were quite new, and spoke confidently of the sudden death of the dragon and of cargoes of rich presents coming down the river to Lake Town. These were inspired largely by the master, and it did not particularly please the dwarves. But in the meantime they were well contented, and they quickly grew fat and strong again. Indeed, within a week they were quite recovered, fitted out in fine cloth of their proper colours, with beards combed and trimmed, and proud steps. Thorin looked and walked as if his kingdom was already regained, and Smaug chopped up into little pieces. Then, as he had said, the dwarves' good feeling towards the little hobbit grew stronger every day. There were no more groans or grumbles. They drank his health, and they patted him on the back, and they made a great fuss of him, which was just as well, for he was not feeling particularly cheerful. He had not forgotten the look of the mountain, nor the thought of the dragons, and he had besides a shocking cold. For 3 days he sneezed and coughed, and he could not go out, and even after that his speeches at banquets were limited to, "Thank you very much." In the meanwhile, the wood elves had gone back up the forest river with their cargoes, and there was great excitement in the king's palace. I have never heard what happened to the chief of the guards and the butler. Nothing, of course, was ever said about keys or barrels while the dwarves stayed in Lake Town, and Bilbo was careful never to become invisible. Still, I dare say, more was guessed than was known, though doubtless Mr. Baggins remained a bit of a mystery. In any case, the king knew now the dwarves' errand, or thought he did, and he said to himself, "Very well, we'll see. No treasure will come back through Mirkwood without my having something to say on the matter. But I expect they will all come to a bad end, and serve them right." He, at any rate, did not believe in dwarves fighting and killing dragons like Smaug, and he strongly suspected attempted burglary or something like it, which shows he was a wise elf, and wiser than the men of the town, though not quite right, as we shall see in the end. He sent out his spies about the shores of the lake, and as far northward towards the mountains as they would go, and waited. At the end of a fortnight, Thorin began to think of departure. While the enthusiasm still lasted in the town, was the time to get help. It would not do to let everything cool down with delay. So he spoke to the master and his counselors, and said that soon he and his company must go on towards the mountain. Then, for the first time, the master was surprised and a little frightened, and he wondered if Thorin was after all really a descendant of the old kings. He had never thought that the dwarves would actually dare to approach Smaug, but believed they were frauds who would sooner or later be discovered and be turned out. He was wrong. Thorin, of course, was really the grandson of the king under the mountain, and there is no knowing what a dwarf will not dare and do for revenge or the recovery of his own. But the master was not sorry at all to let them go. They were expensive to keep, and their arrival had turned things into a long holiday in which business was at a standstill.
In 1,000 feet, you will arrive at your destination.
Let them go and bother Smaug, and see how he welcomes them, he thought. Certainly, O Thorin Thrain's son, Thror's son, was what he said. You must claim your own. The hour is at hand, spoken of old. What help we can offer shall be yours, and we trust to your gratitude when your kingdom is regained. So one day, although autumn was now getting far on, and winds were cold, and leaves were falling fast, 3 large boats left Lake Town, laden with rowers, dwarves, Mr. Baggins, and plenty provisions. Horses and ponies had been sent round by circuitous paths to meet them at their appointed landing place. The master and his counselors bade them farewell from the great steps of the town hall that went down to the lake. People sang on the quays and out of windows. The white oars dipped and splashed, and off they went north up the lake on the last stage of their long journey. The only person thoroughly unhappy was Bilbo. Chapter 11. On the Doorstep. In 2 days' going,